The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Savior, we need you every hour of every day. We not only need you during crisis moments, but also in the solitary moments of daily living. Our lawmakers need you. As they open their hearts to you, fill them with power for today's task. Lord, show them your will for our times and give them the wisdom to say, "Speak, Lord, for we are listening." May the inspiration they receive from you keep their hearts pure, their minds clear, their words true, and their deeds compassionate. And Lord, we pray for the Iranian people who mourn the death of their president. We pray in your loving name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 20th, 2024. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tammy Duckworth, a senator from the state of Illinois, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patty Murray, President pro tempore.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the judiciary, Krissa M. Lanham of Arizona to be United States District Judge for the District of Arizona.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
Last night, Iran confirmed that its president and foreign minister died in a helicopter crash. The condolences from sympathetic regimes were swift. The PRC declared that the Chinese people had lost a good friend. The Kremlin mourned a reliable partner. And Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, who, in spite of Western sanctions, offered his thoughts and prayers. Well, I too would like to extend my condolences to the people of Iran for their long suffering under the brutal theocratic rule of the Islamic Republic. I suspect a great many Iranians would rather Western admirers stop lionizing a man known as the Butcher of Tehran or executing political prisoners. They might prefer that foreign leaders not further legitimize the regime that actively represses all of them. In the meantime, conjecture about key players in the chain of succession and the relative strength of reform and hardline elements has already begun in earnest. To focus on this sort of speculation is to miss something more fundamental about the regime in Tehran. Something I warned the Biden administration about when President Raisi was installed through a customary sham election 3 years ago. We should remember the president of Iran is just a figurehead. The real power rests with the aptly named supreme leader and the state institutions he controls. Supposed reformers and moderates, along with hardliners, have come and gone from Iran's presidency without fundamentally changing how Tehran operates at home or abroad. Meanwhile, the regime's revolutionary orthodoxy has endured for decades, preserved by the clerical establishment and the IRGC. Iran's leaders, its diplomats, and its enablers abroad can say anything they want about the regime's character and outlook, but actions speak far louder than words. And for years, Tehran has moved steadily in just one direction, toward more terrorist violence abroad and more repression at home. And no matter who Iran's president has been, the regime in Tehran has continued to engage in rampant proliferation of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and UAVs while making steady progress toward nuclear weapons capability. So I'd also like to extend my condolences to Iran's neighbors, who still live under the constant threat of a regime that practices what it preaches. Death to Israel, death to America, war on international commerce, and chaos across the Middle East. The untimely death of the president of Iran does not change the underlying threats this regime poses to its own citizens, to its region, and to the free world. These threats continue to demand our collective attention. On a related matter, since the immediate aftermath of October 7th, Israel, her allies, and Jewish people around the world have faced pernicious efforts to equate a sovereign nation's self-defense with barbaric acts of terrorism. We've seen it in the specious media tropes about, quote, cycles of violence, end quote, in university statements bemoaning Israel's self-defense actions, and in our own elected leaders' attempts to browbeat Israel's coalition government for seeking to restore its people's security. But today, the most noxious attempt at moral equivalence comes from unelected international bureaucrats brandishing a contrived and perverted authority. In the same breath, the self-aggrandizing prosecutor of the International Criminal Court applied for arrest warrants for both Hamas chief terrorists and Israel's duly elected prime minister. It's a damning development, but not for the supposed subjects of the application. The ICC has succeeded only in discrediting itself even further as a rogue kangaroo court utterly untethered to morality or justice. For those of us who've long rejected this international farce of a court and its efforts to gobble up jurisdiction, this fact was hardly news. I've refused to acknowledge any ICC authority to conduct politicized investigations of American service members, as it has tried illegitimately to do literally for years. And weeks ago, several of our colleagues and I warned the institution specifically against lighting any last shred of credibility on fire in an attempt to equate Hamas' calculated cruelty with Israel's right to self-defense. Putting its arrogance on full display, the judicial junta in The Hague responded by claiming that holding it accountable for this power grab would somehow violate international law. Unfortunately, there is still indeed reality to be spelled out more clearly. This isn't about Prime Minister Netanyahu. It isn't about so-called international law. In fact, the leader of Israel's opposition condemned the ICC decision as a complete moral failure. But too many Senate Democrats require frequent reminders of how Israel's national unity government works and what the Israelis exposed the moral rot and terrorist complicity of another international organization, UNRWA. The Biden administration was reluctant to ignore its loud base of campus radicals and end U.S. funding. Well, today's news lays down another gauntlet. It's time for the president and other Western leaders to finally pick it up. Support Israel's right to defend itself against terrorist savages like Sinwar. Reject the fiction that unaccountable bureaucrats in The Hague have any power over a sovereign nation that isn't a signatory to its authority. Commit to imposing significant costs on the court and its agents if it pursues shameful and baseless charges against Israel. And choose once and for all a loud campus mob.
Madam President from Illinois.
The senior senator from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, tomorrow the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I chair, will hold a hearing on competition in the prescription drug market and its impact on the prices that Americans pay for medication. Patients in the United States pay the highest prescription drug prices in the world, nearly 3 times what people in other developed countries pay for common medications and sometimes for exactly the same drug as prescribed in America. Take a well-known name, Jardiance, a diabetes treatment. You can almost hear the young lady singing the song, can't you? It retails for $700 a month in the United States. Do you know what the exact same drug made by the same company in the same place goes for in Canada? $150. $700 for American citizens, $150 for Canadians for exactly the same drug. What's the difference? The difference is the Canadian government cares, and the Canadian government started acting years ago to protect the consumers in their country. The average new cancer drug entering the market last year had an annual list price of more than $200,000, and the prices keep going up. In 2022, drug manufacturers raised prices on more than 1,200 medications by an average of 32%, 4 times the rate of inflation. For patients already facing a gut-wrenching diagnosis, the last thing they should have to worry about is whether they can afford life-saving treatment. Yet 20% of seniors report that sky-high cost of their medication forces them to skip doses or cut pills. No drug is more representative of this problem than insulin, the life or death drug for those with diabetes. You know when it was discovered? 100 years ago. By Americans, not this time. Canadian inventors not only found this new life-saving drug, they surrendered their patent rights, the rights to control it and the rights to receive profit from it, for $1. Why? They said a life and death drug should not be a matter of bargaining, and they believed no one should profit off this life-saving medicine. When Eli Lilly launched its insulin product, Humalog, in 1999, a vial cost a modest $21. But over the next 20 years, the company raised its price more than 24 times to more than $330 for a vial. Thankfully, President Biden and Democrats in Congress capped the price of insulin at $35 a month under Medicare and the Inflation Reduction Act. It is unfortunate and impossible to explain. Not a single Republican joined us in voting for this historic legislation to cap the price of insulin at $35 a month for Medicare. And 8 pharmaceutical companies raced to the federal courthouses in the hopes of stopping another component of that bill, which enables Medicare to negotiate for lower drug costs. Big Pharma participates in the Veterans Health Administration, which has the authority to bargain for lower costs for our veterans, thank goodness. They've had that authority for decades. Yet we heard cries of price controls and socialism from Big Pharma as they oppose letting Medicare simply negotiate a better deal on behalf of senior citizens and taxpayers. Last fall, President Biden announced the first 10 drugs that would see price reductions from these negotiations. These drugs cost the Medicare program more than $50 billion last year alone. When the president announced his list, I'm sure many Americans already recognize the names of all 10 popular drugs. Why would we recognize them? Because they're the most heavily advertised drugs on television. Here's a trivia question you want to take to the next party you attend. How many countries on earth make it legal to advertise prescription drugs? 2. We know one, it's the United States. Anybody know the other one? New Zealand. The United States and New Zealand are the only countries in the world where you can legally advertise prescription drugs. Americans see an average of 9 drug ads on television every single day. By filling the airwaves with these ads, Big Pharma is inflating demand for the most expensive drugs on the market. Some manufacturers are willing to spend more than $100 million a year to make sure that all of us can spell Xarelto and ask the doctor for it. But they never tell you the price, do they? You see all those ads and all the information and all the gibberish they put at the end of it? Don't you think it's worth knowing that Xarelto costs more than $500 a month in the United States when a generic or other lower-priced alternative may be just as effective? That's why Senator Grassley, Republican Senator of Iowa, joined me in introducing a common-sense, bipartisan bill to end the secrecy surrounding drug prices in advertising. Our bill would require Big Pharma to disclose the price on the ad. Incidentally, in 2020, Xarelto's manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, spent $22 billion that year on advertising, nearly double the $12 billion it spent that year on research for new drugs. Big Pharma will tell you the high prices paid by Americans are just the cost of innovation. They point to the money they spend on research and development to create the next generation of life-saving drugs. I want them to come up with new drugs. I want them to make a profit in doing that, but I want them to be reasonable in the process. They always fail to mention one fundamental fact that we, as taxpayers, should not forget. Taxpayers fund the bulk of basic biomedical research through the National Institutes of Health. In fact, studies have shown that 99% of drugs introduced by the drug companies and approved by the FDA between 2010 and 2019 benefited from NIH research to get their start. And too often, the prices charged by Big Pharma do not reflect scientific advancement. Rather, they're the result of manipulation not by researchers or doctors, but by lawyers in the patent system. Take the blockbuster drug Humira, at one time the most heavily advertised drug on television. Its manufacturer, AbbVie, introduced the drug in 2002. For more than 20 years, the company exploited intellectual property laws to build a thicket of 165 patents. The way it works is this. If you discover a new drug, you have a legal right to be the exclusive salesman of that drug during a certain period of time. If there's a variation on that formula on that drug, the patent time can be extended. So the patent lawyers are always at work to make sure they extend the patent period of price monopoly for these drug companies. It's supposed to reach a point where there's competition over a generic form of the drug. The lawyers do their darndest to make sure they don't reach that point. The result, more than $200 billion in revenue over Humira's 20 years of exclusivity, and that drug is not unique. A recent study found that the top 10 best-selling drugs in 2021 had a combined 1,429 patent applications filed, 72% of which were filed after the FDA approved the drug for sale. These blockbusters were covered by an average of 42 active patents, blocking generic competition and generating windfall profits for the drug companies. The Judiciary Committee has taken a leadership role in addressing Big Pharma's abuse. Last year, the committee unanimously reported 5 bipartisan drug pricing bills to address anti-competitive pay-for-delay agreements, sham citizen petition, patent thickets, products, among other issues. This includes my bill with Senators Tillis, Coons, and Grassley to improve information sharing between the FDA and Patent Office to ensure accuracy in the representations made by pharmaceutical companies to prevent gamesmanship. Tomorrow's hearing is going to be co-chaired by my colleague and friend from Vermont, Senator Peter Welch. He told me when he recently came to the Senate, replacing Senator Pat Leahy, that this was an issue near and dear to him. I assured him there would be a hearing on the subject because it's so important to the country and so many people have an interest in it. And I've been watching all those drug ads day in and day out like everybody else. It's time that we have the facts put in front of the American people instead of just the advertising and the jingles. Our committee work is far from done. Tomorrow's hearing will shed light on additional obstacles to reducing drug prices and how our committee can help solve this problem for the American people. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President,
The majority.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Madam President, I would like to begin with a statement about the ICC prosecutor's announcement from earlier this morning. The ICC prosecutor's decision seeking arrest warrants for Israeli leaders alongside Hamas terrorists is not only profoundly unfair, but it is reprehensible. As disappointing as the ICC's decision is, it comes as no surprise, because for decades and decades, the ICC has shown it harbors deep biases against Israel. This decision, suggesting an equivalency between Israel and Hamas, is another glaring example of that bias against Israel. As I have said many times, there has never been and there can never be any equivalence between Israel's right to defend itself against terror and Hamas's barbarity. The ICC's decision seeking warrants against Israeli leaders is not only shameful, but also fails to follow protocol and process in a country where it has zero jurisdiction. I fiercely oppose the ICC's decision, and I will work with President Biden and members on all sides to keep support for Israel strong and unwavering. Now, on the border, 3 months ago, Madam President, 3 months ago, Senate Republicans blocked the strongest, most comprehensive border security bill we've seen in a generation. This week, Republicans will get another chance to do the right thing. Border security, we all know, is one of the most contentious issues that we have to wrestle with in Congress. But most people agree the status quo cannot continue. Our southern border is in desperate need of more resources, and our immigration system is in serious need of repair. President Biden in recent weeks has taken many actions to increase sanctions against human rights abusers, reform asylum, and enhance drug enforcement to the maximum extent his office allows. But, as our Republican colleagues have said for years, the only long-term solution to the border is bipartisan legislation from Congress. Well, there is good news. Such bipartisan legislation does exist and is ready to go. I'm talking, of course, about the Bipartisan Border Act negotiated earlier this year by Senators Murphy and Sinema and Langford, and endorsed by the National Border Patrol Council, the Chamber of Commerce, and the very conservative Wall Street Journal editorial page. This week, the Senate will have an opportunity to move again on this bill. For the information of my colleagues, tomorrow I plan to file cloture on the motion to proceed to the Bipartisan Border Act. The Senate will then vote on our bipartisan border bill on Thursday. All those who say we need to act on the border will get a chance this week to show they're serious about fixing the problem. Let me repeat. The Senate will vote on our bipartisan border bill on Thursday. All those who say we need to act on the border will get a chance this week to show they're serious about fixing the border. I implore my Republican colleagues to join us in advancing this bill. We're going to need bipartisan support if there's any hope of getting this bill done. I will be clear. We do not expect every Democrat or every Republican to come out in favor of the bill. But as I've said before, over and over again, the only way to pass this bill is with broad bipartisan support. I expect to see that on the Democratic side, and I hope we'll see it on the Republican side as well. This bill was written explicitly with the goal of getting support from both parties, unlike messaging bills like H.R. 2, which did not have bipartisan support to get through both chambers. And the bill we're voting on this Thursday is practically the same bill that Senators Murphy and Sinema and Langford and others negotiated 3 months ago. Republicans agreed to the substance of this bill. It is not at all some new measure or something that comes only from the Democratic side. The bill we'll vote on this Thursday reforms asylum, boosts staffing at the border, cracks down on drugs like fentanyl, and gives emergency powers to shut the border when crossings meet a certain threshold. All issues Republicans have said we must address. If our bipartisan border bill was good enough to win the support of the union that represents Border Patrol officers, it should be good enough to win the support of Senate Republicans. If you judge this bill by its substance, and take out the partisanship injected by Donald Trump, it is objectively a tough, serious-minded, and critically a bipartisan solution to the border. In fact, when we released this bill earlier this year, many of our Republican colleagues were surprised at how strong it was, at least in private. For a short while, it seemed like we finally had a bill both parties could link arms on and pass together. Of course, we all know what happened. Donald Trump happened. He barged into the border debate and publicly came out against the bill, and the rest of his Republican supporters fell into place like dominoes. Let me be clear. The border bill did not fail 3 months ago because it was too weak. On the contrary, the border bill failed because it was too strong for Donald Trump's liking and risked taking away an issue he wanted to exploit on the campaign trail. He said that himself. Again, the border bill did not fail 3 months ago because it was too weak. It failed because it was too strong for Donald Trump's liking, and it risked taking away an issue he wanted to exploit on the campaign trail. As we all know, he was explicit about his intentions. He said, "Blame it on me," as if this was all one giant game to Donald Trump. He really doesn't care about the border, just cares about the politics and the gamesmanship. Well, we, the American people, do not have the luxury of playing games with border security. The issue is too important to ignore, and the bill we negotiated earlier this year is too good to pass up. So we're going to give Republicans another chance this week. In the words of one of my Senate Republican colleagues when we worked on the border bill earlier this year, this moment will pass. Do not let it pass. I couldn't agree more. Now on judge shopping. Today was supposed to be a significant day for gun safety in America. Today was supposed to be the day new rules, closing loopholes on background checks went into effect. Rules that Democrats and Republicans worked on together when we passed the bipartisan gun safety bill 2 years ago. But, surprise, surprise, MAGA radicals have put background check reforms on ice by going to their favorite judge in the entire country, in the Northern District of Texas, and getting him to rubber stamp a nationwide injunction. Today's ridiculous injunction is yet again another consequence of judge shopping, that deeply unfair practice where radicals virtually guarantee favorable outcomes by going in court to a sympathetic judge of their choice. And I say judge in this case because there's only one judge sitting in that district. They know when they go to court, they're getting him to hear the case. Judge shopping jaundices our legal system like few other abuses do. There's no conceivable definition of justice where hard-right litigants can pull a fast one on the will of the American people by getting extremist judges they align with to rubber stamp their agenda. Congress should fix this abuse soon with appropriate legislation. The Constitution clearly allows Congress to exercise oversight of the courts when appropriate. Even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, hardly a liberal, has acknowledged that judge shopping is a problem that ought to be addressed. A few weeks ago, I led a group of 40 senators in introducing a bill that would curtail judge shopping and restore fairness to the judicial system. I hope both sides can work together on this bill to ensure that nobody gets an unfair advantage in a court of law simply based on a judge's personal, ideological preferences. We will continue weighing legislative options to ensure that the federal judiciary remains committed to equal justice under law. Judge shopping moves us away from that noble ideal in a very big way. Nominations. This week, the Senate will confirm more of President Biden's outstanding judicial nominees for lifetime appointments to the federal bench, and will hit a major milestone along the way. Later this afternoon, the Senate will vote on the confirmation of Seth Aframe of New Hampshire to be a circuit court judge on the First Circuit. Mr. Aframe would make an exceptional addition to the First Circuit and was given a unanimous rating of well qualified by the American Bar Association. A longtime member of the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Hampshire, he has argued approximately 100 cases before the First Circuit on a broad range of criminal and civil cases. When confirmed, Mr. Aframe will be the 198th judge confirmed since President Biden took office. And as soon as tomorrow, I expect the Senate will reach the significant milestone of 200 judges under Senate Democrats and under President Biden. I salute Senator Durbin and the Judiciary Committee for the good work they have done in this regard. It's a figure, 200, that we can all be proud of and shows how intensely focused we are on filling the bench with jurists who will make our democracy stronger and uphold the rule of law. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection. Thank
you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today to speak about the economy. Joe Biden is clearly the president of high prices. People all across the country, all 50 states, well aware that this is going to be Joe Biden's enduring legacy. Prices spiked again in April. The statistics are out. Prices have been rising again and again and again. Price increases have been now above 3% for the last 37 months. This is the longest period in history of high prices since the late 1980s. You know, President Biden continues to repeat a falsehood. You could call it a lie, because he has said time and again that inflation was 9% when he came into office. This is pure confusion on his part. Even the liberal fact checkers, people at CNN, people in the Washington Post, have said what President Biden is saying about inflation is flat out false. It's wrong. In January of 2021, the day that the current President Biden took the oath of office, the inflation rate in America was 1.4%. Today, prices are almost 20% higher than they were the day he took the oath of office. The burden of Bidenomics on the American public is crushing, it's compounding, and of course it's cumulative. It continues to add on every single day. But Democrats in this chamber and around the country deny this economic reality. Certainly the Democrat in the White House denies this economic reality. And President Biden proved that he was completely disconnected from the suffering American families. Earlier this month, he said Americans have, quote, the money to spend. I'm not sure who he's talking to, but that's not the case across America, and it's not the case in my home state of Wyoming. Democrats are completely out of touch on the economy because they are out of touch with American voters, the citizens of this country. Rising prices have plagued Americans for the last 3 years. Everyday life costs more and more and more. Under Joe Biden, Americans are squeezed, they are stressed, and they are struggling to get by. More than half of Americans will tell you that the economic conditions that they see day in and day out are poor for them personally. More than 80% of Americans saying that high prices are their number one concern. That's what Americans are suffering from today. President Biden's policies are not the cure for inflation and our economic anxieties. Joe Biden and the Democrats' policies are the cause of our economic struggles. Joe Biden and the Democrats in this chamber and in the House of Representatives at a time when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, they approved more than $3 trillion in wasteful Washington spending. The President added more than $1 trillion additionally on stifling and punishing economic regulations. He launched a war on American energy, hiked energy costs for families. Gas prices went up, electricity prices went up. Because of failed Bidenomics, Americans are paying over $12,000 more a year this year than they did the year that he came into office, just to buy the same things that they could buy the day he came into the White House. It's over $1,000 a month. That's what the American people are seeing today, Madam President. A $100 cart of groceries in 2019, the cost now of that same cart full of groceries, not very full, $137. Gallon of gas was in 2021, $2.38. Today, in many of the battleground states, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, it's approaching $4 a gallon. Now, of course, high prices aren't the only problem. Interest rates are at the highest level in 23 years. High interest rates are a bitter fruit of Bidenomics. People are suffering when they have to take out a loan. This is causing significant affordability crisis all across the country and in all age groups. Under these failed policies of the Biden administration, younger people, younger Americans have been demoralized. They are delaying life's biggest moments. Home ownership is slipping far clearly out of the reach of most young married couples and young people trying to start a family. Young Americans are facing the costliest housing market ever. Borrowing costs have soared. Biden took office, they were 2.7%. Today, over 7%. Home prices today are nearly 6 times higher than the average household income. That's a record ratio, 6 times higher than the average household income. Other costs, utility costs, insurance costs, all costs are climbing, and they're all caused by the amount of spending we've had under this administration. Younger Americans are having trouble buying a car. The price of car loans has gone way up, as well as the price of automobiles themselves. Younger Americans are also forced to rely on credit cards more and more. They are developing mounting debt, which is going to continue to saddle them in their future. Look, young Americans will tell you that they are overextended and they are distressed, and they're begging for relief. Today's high prices and high interest rates are going to create tomorrow's troubles. Now, President Biden has failed to protect the American dream. We now have an entire generation of young Americans who can't afford to buy a home, can't afford to start a business, can't afford to begin a family, and certainly can't afford to grow any savings that they may have. Americans are absolutely fed up with big spending, high-priced Democrats. People are financially exhausted by Joe Biden's high prices. People are ready to move beyond Bidenomics and beyond Joe Biden. Time for a change. Senate Republicans are ready to put America back on track. We're fighting to lower costs. That's what we're hearing every weekend at home. Get down the prices of things that are up under Joe Biden. Stop the wasteful Washington spending. And please unleash American energy. That's the solution to the problems facing America today. This is how we can help make life more affordable for all Americans. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Madam President. In 1969, the city of Montreal, Canada, discovered what it's like to live in a world without police. For 16 hours on October 7th, the city's full police force went on strike. What ensued is now called Montreal's Night of Terror. The city rang out with gunshots, glass shattering, and flames erupting. Just 3 hours after the strike began, the first bank was robbed. Robbers stormed 9 more before the police returned. Thefts, vandalism, and mob violence took the city by storm. There were 450 break-ins and over 30 armed holdups. A crowd 800 strong overturned a bus and set vehicles ablaze. The government sent provincial police and army officers into the city, but by then the chaos was already in full force. A sniper shot one officer, killing him. The result of Montreal's Night of Terror was 2 dead men, dozens of injuries, over 100 arrests, and close to $3 million in property damage. Less than a day without police was a nightmare for Montreal. Here in America, we often take our strong police force for granted. We enjoy the safety and protection of law enforcement, sometimes without even realizing it. But if trends continue, we will inch closer to living the nightmare of a world without police. In 2022, almost 50% more officers resigned than in 2019. Almost 20% more officers retired. The number of police officers nationwide decreased by 4,000 between 2020 and 2023. A study in 2023 found that over the prior 2 years, at least 12 American towns completely dissolved their police departments. I've been speaking with law enforcement in Nebraska and around the country about growing staffing challenges for years. I greatly respect the state and local control of law enforcement agencies, so I always ask them how I can make existing federal tools more supportive of their work. Based on those conversations, I introduced the Recruit and Retain Act, which the House passed last week. I am thankful to the Nebraska officers and sheriffs who collaborated with me to craft legislation with bipartisan appeal. As retirements increase and new applications decline, departments are shrinking, burdening the officers who are trying to keep them afloat. Understaffed departments are doing their best to keep up, but they don't always have the resources to hire all the officers that they need. The Recruit and Retain Act offers them better access to resources to reverse this trend. My legislation improves the Department of Justice's community-oriented policing services, or COPS, the hiring grant program. The bill extends COPS grants for specific onboarding expenses like background checks and psychological evaluations. It also provides clear guidance to the understaffed agencies applying for this funding, and it alleviates administrative burdens that come with those applications. These changes, they will allow departments to consider more applicants and hire more officers. Recruit and Retain also establishes the Pipeline Partnership Program to promote student interest in law enforcement careers. Departments and local schools will work together to launch mentorships opportunities that give young people an inside look at law enforcement work. This will not only create a hiring pipeline for police departments, but it will also strengthen community relationships with law enforcement. Finally, my bill directs the Government Accountability Office to investigate the causes of recent recruitment challenges and those effects on public safety. We see some of these causes and effects already. Anti-police movements like far left defund the police, that's demonized our law enforcement. And we've seen rising crime levels in places like Portland and Minneapolis and New York City after they cut funding for their police departments. Nonetheless, we haven't seen comprehensive studies that evaluate all levels of law enforcement in agencies of all sizes across the country. To address staffing issues, we need to have the data on exactly what is causing these problems and how they are compromising the safety of our communities. These are practical changes that take our law enforcement a step forward in rebuilding their departments, a goal that will serve officers, will serve local communities, and it will serve our nation as a whole. Our police and other law enforcement officers, they do the essential work to keep us safe and secure. Choosing not to support them is to choose chaos, lawlessness, a nightmare. But by passing my bill, the House and the Senate have both chosen to support our police as they face these staffing challenges. And I urge President Biden to do the same by signing the Recruit and Retain Act into law. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Texas? And we are not.
Madam President, last Thursday night as I was sitting on my airplane scheduled to go to Houston, Texas, a severe storm slammed the entire southeastern portion of our state, bringing heavy rains, roaring winds, and flooding to millions of people in the area. Now, Houston and southeast Texas are no strangers to hurricanes and natural disasters, but this was something altogether different. 100-mile-per-hour winds ripped through the region, tearing windows out of skyscrapers in downtown Houston and toppling transmission towers, power lines, and uprooting trees. Homes, businesses, roads, and vehicles were damaged by the storms, and sadly, at least 8 Texans have lost their lives. Shortly after the storm, more than 1 million Texans lost power, and it's starting to get warm in Texas as we approach the summer, and some 200,000 homes remain without electricity or air conditioning. Today, more than 50 campuses across the Houston Independent School District are closed due to power outages. As I said, the Houston region is no stranger to storms, and Texans did as they always do. They immediately mobilized to support those who suffered the worst impact. I want to commend the brave first responders and volunteers and just the good neighbors who supported the emergency response over the last several days, as well as the crews who are working to clear debris and restore power even as I speak. As we move from rescue to recovery efforts, my team and I are prepared to help in any way we can to help those communities rebuild. Madam President, now on another matter, we know we're about 6 months out from the next election. And as President Biden campaigns for another term, he seems desperate to convince the American people that America's economic troubles aren't his fault and are somehow a figment of their imagination. Last week, he said inflation was at 9% when I came in, and now it's down to 3%. This marked the second time in only a handful of days that the president made this claim, and it would be great if it were true. The fact is, under President Biden's economic policies, inflation has reached a 40-year high and is stubbornly resisting efforts by the Federal Reserve to bring it down. In reality, inflation was at only 1.4% when President Biden took office. And under his leadership, Washington Democrats went on a crazy spending spree that sent inflation skyrocketing to the highest in 40 years. I know we're all familiar with the Federal Reserve and its role to try to bring down inflation by making money tighter, and they do that by raising interest rates. But that's not without a cost. And the ability of hardworking Texas families and other Americans to buy a car, buy a house, obviously those have been negatively impacted. And if you went to the grocery store and filled up a basket of groceries the day that President Biden took office and then did it again recently, you'll see that your grocery prices went up 36% thanks to President Biden's policies. And mainly what that is, it's not about the Federal Reserve, it's about all the spending that our Democratic colleagues have done here, about $2.7 trillion of partisan spending bills, which are like gasoline on the inflation fire. Finally, as a result of tight money policies by the Federal Reserve, inflation has cooled somewhat, but prices remain unbearably high for most families, and inflation is still more than double what it was when President Biden took office. This may be the president's latest attempt to try to divert attention and misrepresent his record, but it certainly isn't the only one. Last month, the president tweeted this. He said, Donald Trump was very proud of his $2 trillion tax cut that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy and biggest corporations and exploded the federal debt. That tax cut is going to expire. If I'm reelected, it's going to stay expired. Well, forget for a minute that President Biden has misrepresented who benefited from the tax cut and bringing more foreign investment back to the United States by bringing our corporate and business tax rates in line with other democracies around the world. As a matter of fact, before COVID, the economy was about the best it's ever been in my adult lifetime, because the economy was roaring back in part because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act bill that we passed in 2017. First, this is an interesting time for the president to start paying attention to the national debt, something he's forgotten about entirely for the last 3.5 years. And on his watch, our national debt is now approaching $35 trillion. As I said, he and congressional Democrats spent nearly $2.7 trillion in less than 18 months on things like handouts for union bosses and money for something they called climate justice, whatever that is. But apparently tax relief for working families is where he draws the line. But the second issue that I can't ignore is this. Allowing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to expire would raise taxes on virtually everybody, including working families. The Wall Street Journal recently took a look at this. This was 10 days ago, May the 10th. They looked at data from the Tax Foundation and determined that, quote, if the tax cuts expire, which is something that President Biden said he would see to, about 62% of households would pay more, 9% would pay less, and the rest would be largely unaffected, according to the Tax Foundation, as I said. So, based on President Biden's tweet that he would let the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire, 62% of households in America would pay more taxes. Given the financial pain, mainly caused by inflation, that families are already feeling, a larger tax burden is the very last thing American families need. But that seems to be the path on which President Biden is headed. And it would be salt in the wound for the families who are already struggling to cover their basic living expenses, like that basket of groceries that's cost 36% more now than it did 3.5 years ago. Another thing to note is that this would actually break President Biden's marquee promise to never raise taxes on households making under $400,000 a year. Once that was pointed out, the president's team quickly shifted into damage control and said, well, the president really doesn't want all of this law to expire, just the portions that affect people making more than $400,000 a year. But it's hard to know whether the president is coming or going when he makes these statements. And every time you take him at his word, his political team comes in and does cleanup and says, no, he really didn't mean that. But the president already made his statement in the clearest of possible terms. The tax cut will expire unless extended, and if he's elected, he said it will stay expired, raising taxes on 62% of households. Of course, it's no surprise that President Biden would allow tax increases on working families. After all, during his presidency, it has been defined by giveaways for unlikely winners. First, there's the handouts for wealthy electric vehicle purchasers. The horribly misnamed Inflation Reduction Act included massive handouts for some of the most expensive vehicles on the market, vehicles that many Americans cannot simply afford, yet they are being asked to subsidize rich people getting fancy new electric vehicles. Wealthy Americans earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year can receive up to $7,500 in taxpayer assistance to buy an electric vehicle, including those made in China. Democrats passed this bill at a time when many people couldn't and still can't afford basic expenses. Democrats responded by forcing every person in America to subsidize expensive electric vehicles for well-to-do people. The initial estimate pegged the cost of these EV tax credits at just over $30 billion. $30 billion. But private forecasters later released an updated estimate which found that the actual cost of these electric vehicle tax credits is more than $196 billion, 6.5 times higher than advertised. Of course, hardworking families are the ones footing the bill for these tax credits, which disproportionately benefit wealthy people. Then there's the president's attempt to, quote, cancel student debt for millions of borrowers. Now, his administration has offered multiple plans to wipe away loans for millions of borrowers and stick taxpayers with the bill. The Supreme Court told him he couldn't, and he went back to the drawing board and figured a way to go ahead and do it. To state the obvious, the vast majority of Americans don't benefit from that. 87% of Americans do not have outstanding student loan debt. So the 87% are going to pay for the 13% who do. Many people decided not to go to college, either because they couldn't afford it or because they pursued some other course of study. Many worked while pursuing a degree. Many paid off their loans after graduating, just as they agreed to do. Still, President Biden expects that every single person without college debt to shoulder the cost for someone else's degree. This is, after fact, something they agreed to do by contract, to pay that money back. His student debt cancellation plan would cost taxpayers $475 billion, even though only 13% of Americans reap the benefits. The new plans he rolled out earlier this year would cost an additional $84 billion. It is fundamentally unfair to expect taxpayers with no student loan debt to pay for someone else's degree, especially when that person agreed to pay it back. Madam President, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which President Biden wants to see expire, isn't the problem. This law puts money back in the pockets of hardworking Texans by allowing workers to keep more of what they earn. See, that's the problem here in Washington, D.C. So many bureaucrats and insiders think that the money that you earn is actually what you are allowed to keep by the government, because it's really all the government's, and the government just allows you to keep some of it. Well, they have it exactly backward. It's the money of the people who earn it, and the people who earn it pay their taxes as they're required to do so. But it's their money, and every dollar of a tax increase that Washington orders is $1 less in their pocket to spend on their family. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act gave tax relief to small businesses and job creators, unleashing a wave of economic growth. And it encouraged companies who had invested their money abroad to bring that money back home and build new businesses or expand their businesses here and not overseas. After this bill became law, unemployment decreased, wages increased, and communities across America experienced a wave of economic success. Unfortunately, the pandemic threw a wrench into our humming economy, and then President Biden came along with a sledgehammer, seemingly determined to destroy every economic gain we made under President Trump. His policy has ushered in the worst inflation in 40 years, and as a result, hardworking families are struggling to make ends meet. The cost of groceries, gas, rent have skyrocketed, while household incomes remain anemic. Many Americans who've been scrimping and saving for years in order to buy a home have had to keep that dream on hold because of high interest rates. And now the president seems intent on allowing the 2017 tax cuts to expire, ensuring that millions more of Americans will pay more in taxes. If President Biden manages to win another term in the White House, I worry about how much more economic pain he will inflict on families. Inflation is up, interest rates are up, and according to President Biden, another term in office for him means your taxes will go up too. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Quinn Eisenfeld and Charlie...
Senator, the Senate's in a quorum call.
Oh, I'm sorry, Madam President. I ask that we come out of the quorum call, please.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Charlie November and Quinn Eisenfeld, who are interns in my office, be granted floor privileges until May 21st, 2024.
Without objection.
And also, Madam President, with me today is a current member of my staff, one of my colleagues, Mr. Josh Dunn. I want to talk, Madam President, about a topic I hate to talk about. It's very unpleasant, but it's necessary that we talk about this. Some of my colleagues want it to go away, but it's not going away. I thought, Madam President, that we had all agreed that sexual predators and bigots are not welcome in America's workplaces. We've all heard of the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement, President Biden endorsed it. Many of my colleagues have actively supported it, as have I. The Me Too movement reminded us all that America is no place for creepy old men who sexually harass and demean their employees. I thought we had agreed to that. I don't remember seeing any exceptions in the Me Too movement for President Biden's appointees to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We call it the FDIC. There's not supposed to be a carve-out for bigots and perverts at the FDIC to harass their coworkers when they're supposed to be regulating America's banks. So why hasn't President Biden shown FDIC Chairman Mr. Martin Gruenberg and his leadership team the door? Why hasn't he fired them? Based on the latest report from the agency, not a single Biden appointee should keep his or her job at the FDIC. Now, Mr. Gruenberg released a statement a few minutes ago. He didn't say he resigned. He said he's prepared to resign as soon as his successor is confirmed by the United States Senate. In the meantime, he's going to continue on as FDIC chairman. It triggers my gag reflex. I mentioned this report. This report, 234 pages, it was done by a law firm called Cleary Gottlieb at the request of the FDIC. The FDIC and Mr. Gruenberg were forced to ask for this report because the Wall Street Journal published a series of articles about the sexcapades at the FDIC. And the FDIC leadership was forced to respond. Cleary Gottlieb issued this report. I was very suspect at first because Mr. Gruenberg and others had picked Cleary Gottlieb to do it. But after the report's been issued and I've had a chance to read it, it's clear to me that the law firm, as it should have, pulled no punches. The report tells us that nearly 1 in 10 employees, 1 in 10, at the FDIC has experienced sexual harassment, racial discrimination, verbal abuse, or other inappropriate behavior while working at the agency. I want you to listen to this. I hate to have to say it, but I want the American people to understand what's been going on under Mr. Gruenberg's leadership at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is what the report told us. One Hispanic employee told investigators with the Cleary Gottlieb law firm that his FDI supervisor made him recite the Pledge of Allegiance at work to, quote, prove that they were American. Another FDIC employee reported that her supervisor told her, quote, you're a mother. You don't belong in the workplace, end quote. The report goes on. One senior FDIC official who had a reputation for visiting brothels during his work trips, isn't that special, sent his coworker a photograph of his penis. Another senior FDIC official who allegedly was thrown out of a strip club during a work trip because he groped the dancers, this official the same day asked his female coworker, quote, does your husband eat you? An FDIC field officer pursued sexual relationships with several female employees, including a student intern. Another employee reported that a former FDIC executive, quote, grabbed her and rubbed himself on her after a happy hour. My God. One female employee recounted more than 6 years of persistent sexual harassment from a senior FDIC bank examiner. She said the examiner continuously sent her disturbing text messages, including one that said, quote, get naked, bitch. The employee said the behavior bordered on the edge of stalking. You think? Look, I could go on for hours here. I'm not sure my stomach can stand it. In total, there's 6,000 workers at the FDIC. In total, more than 500 reported misconduct by their bosses. Creepy old men. They reported 145 incidents of sexual harassment, 436 reports of gender, sexuality, or race-based discrimination, and 320 incidents of verbal abuse and bullying. The investigators in this report noted that many of these employees had never previously reported the harassment because the employees at the FDIC had a real and widespread fear of retaliation from the agency's management. The FDIC employees who did report through the years, who did report their harassment to the agency, quickly realized that it was a mistake and a waste of time. From 2015 to 2023, 92 brave employees directly reported incidents and instances of harassment or abuse to the agency. Good for them. The management of the FDIC didn't fire or demote or dock the pay of a single creep because of these reports. In fact, the FDIC often punished the victims rather than the predators. They would move the victims from the victim's job, not the predator. The predator got to stay. The victims were moved. Didn't matter if they were experienced, didn't matter if the victim enjoyed his or her job, they had to move because a creep was molesting them. In fact, when a male examiner called his colleague, quote, a grizzly bear with tits, close quote, the FDIC relocated the woman instead of the man who made the comment. Again, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm just reciting the details of just 8 of the hundreds of reports of harassment at the FDIC. Now, FDIC Chairman, Mr. Martin Gruenberg, he's been a top official at the FDIC for 2 decades, as the FDIC has devolved into what apparently is a hellscape for its employees. Mr. Gruenberg has been chairman of the FDIC for 10 of the last 13 years. He started at the agency in 2005. Mr. Gruenberg didn't just supervise the harassment at the FDIC. According to the report, he participated in it. According to Mr. Gruenberg's employees, Chairman Gruenberg repeatedly, quote, disrespected, disparaged, and mistreated, end quote, his staff. Not the predators, but his staff that was trying to help him manage the agency. According to the report, Mr. Gruenberg would berate them, threaten to fire them, participate in, quote, embarrassing and inappropriate, close quote, group chats with them, and throw temper tantrums, where he'd throw papers his staff prepared for him against the wall. One of his loyal staff members told investigators, quote, in my entire career of 35 years, in my entire career of 35 years, I've never had anybody treat me like that. Reports of Chairman Gruenberg's abusive behavior ranged from 2007 to just last year, showing that he's been a menace to his employees for as long as anyone, just about as long as anyone can remember. Yet when my friends in the House of Representatives asked him if he'd ever been formally accused of abuse, you know what he said? He seemed to forget that he was the target of an abuse allegation. He said no. He had to go back and later correct the record to confirm that he was. Mr. Gruenberg didn't just struggle with holding himself responsible for bad behavior, but he also refused to hold others accountable too. He even handpicked a known abuser. He picked one of these creepy old men, someone whose outburst had cost the FDIC more than $100,000 in a settlement for a key promotion to serve as the FDIC's general counsel. Employees told investigators that they expect Chairman Gruenberg's leadership team to, quote, pay, promote, or move, close quote, the serial predators within the FDIC. It's all in the report. Mr. Gruenberg has not once taken responsibility for his failed leadership. He said he was sorry, but he's never taken responsibility. When he was speaking with the investigators who compiled this report, Mr. Gruenberg denied every single solitary allegation. Now, the role of the investigators was not to advise the FDIC about whether Mr. Gruenberg and his leadership team should resign. But if you read the report, 200 plus pages, it's clear what they think. The investigators said Mr. Gruenberg's, quote, apparent inability or unwillingness to recognize how others experience certain difficult interactions with him would make it difficult, I would use the word impossible, for him to restore the FDIC to something that resembles a respectable workplace. Chairman Gruenberg is far from the only bad apple at the FDIC. That much is clear from the report. Not everyone is a bad apple at the FDIC. There are many employees who are very good employees there, but not all of them. And they've been getting away with this for years. In my opinion, after you read this report, you would conclude that everyone in senior management either knew of the gross, disgusting, and bigoted behavior and did nothing, or they've proven themselves to be such incompetent leaders that they don't deserve to oversee a pet goldfish, much less a federal agency. If the executives at the FDIC had any sense of decency, they would resign today, not issue some weenie statement that, yeah, I know things are bad at the FDIC, and I'll consider resigning as soon as the Senate confirms my successor, but I'm going to continue on in the meantime. That's the statement that Mr. Gruenberg issued. And you know what we've heard out of the Biden White House? Nothing. Zero. Zilch. Nada. If I could fire Mr. Gruenberg, I would. But the only person who can fire Mr. Gruenberg is President Biden. Yet no one at the White House wants to talk about this. No one seems interested in firing Chairman Gruenberg or demanding his resignation. Instead, and President Biden won't even address it. He sent a spokeswoman out to suggest that President Biden has not fired Mr. Gruenberg because, quote, Chairman Gruenberg apologized and has committed to the recommendations that have been provided by the independent report. Let me get this straight. Chairman Gruenberg is going to implement the recommendations which investigated the abuse while he was chairman of the FDIC. Well, let's take a look at a few of the recommended changes that President Biden thinks Chairman Gruenberg is qualified to implement. One recommendation that the report includes says that the FDIC must work to protect the victims of sexual harassment, discrimination, and bullying. You think? How is Mr. Gruenberg, who issued a statement today saying, well, I might resign as soon as the Senate confirms my successor, how is Mr. Gruenberg, who's proven for more than 2 decades that he has no interest in protecting his employees, supposed to get that job done? He won't even admit that he's a bully. How does the White House think he's going to recognize and deter other bullies and predators? Another recommendation in the report is to enact a culture transformation within the FDIC. The investigators recommended that the board of the FDIC hire an individual to oversee this transformation. I thought that's why we had a chairman. If Mr. Gruenberg's past hiring decisions are any indication, he and the board will probably promote the agency's top pervert to the post. The most important recommendation the investigators made, in my view, is that the FDIC must hold leadership accountable for their harassment. Does President Biden really believe? Does he really believe that Chairman Gruenberg is going to hold himself accountable? Are the dozens of creepy old men that the chairman has protected for 2 decades? Put down the bong. Wouldn't firing Mr. Gruenberg and every other bigot or predator in senior management at the FDIC be the obvious first step in holding leadership accountable for this abuse? As one employee put it, allowing Mr. Gruenberg to oversee improvements to the FDIC's culture is like, quote, foxes guarding the hen house. I'd put it another way. It's like asking Alec Baldwin to teach a course on gun safety. Mr. Gruenberg and every single member of senior management ought to hide their heads in a bag. The Me Too movement ought to mean something. And frankly, the White House should hide its head in a bag. I don't read an exception to moral order in the Me Too movement for the FDIC, because Mr. Gruenberg happens to be of a particular party, the same party as the president's. These folks ought to quit, and they ought to quit today. And if they don't, President Biden should fire them. Anything short of firing them will show that President Biden condones this behavior. The FDIC employees, and there are many good ones, they're only responsible for making sure that our banks are secure in the wealthiest and most powerful country in all of human history. Those FDIC employees deserve a professional workplace. They deserve a workplace where they can do their jobs with dignity. And young women don't deserve to be sexually harassed and sent pictures of their boss's genitals. The taxpayers deserve this too. And the banks being examined deserve this as well. You know, when President Biden took office in 2021, I remember in one of his press conferences, I don't know how the subject came up, but the subject of appropriate workplace conduct came up, and President Biden correctly said that he would fire on the spot any appointee who disrespected other members of his staff. Those are the president's words, on the spot. And he told his appointees that he expected them to do the same. The evidence, Madam President, is plentiful that Chairman Gruenberg disrespected his staff and allowed a toxic culture to bloom at the FDIC. He should resign. He should resign immediately. It's time to clean house at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Maine. New Hampshire.
Those are fighting words, Madam President.
They are. Realize.
I ask unanimous consent that Senator Hassan and I both be allowed to finish our remarks before the scheduled vote.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I've come to the floor today in support of Seth Aframe's nomination to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Without a doubt, the depth of Mr. Aframe's legal expertise and his extensive experience at the United States Attorney's Office make him eminently qualified to serve on the First Circuit. And the American Bar Association agrees. They gave Mr. Aframe a unanimous rating of well qualified. But I think what might be most impressive about Mr. Aframe is his overwhelming dedication to serving his community. In fact, one of Mr. Aframe's earliest formative experiences as an aspiring public servant was when he served as a Senate page on this very floor. As we hope all pages will do when their time in the Senate comes to an end, Mr. Aframe carried a passion for public service with him, and it informed his professional trajectory. After graduating from college, Mr. Aframe decided to pursue a law career, going on to attend Georgetown University Law Center. From Georgetown, he spent 3 years in private practice, developing his skills in complex civil litigation, before moving to New Hampshire, where he clerked for Judge Jeffrey Howard on the First Circuit. From there, he went on to join the United States Attorney's Office in Concord. He has served as chief of both the criminal division and the appellate section of the United States Attorney's Office. And during his tenure, Mr. Aframe has tried 20 cases in federal district court and argued more than 100 appeals before the First Circuit, giving Aframe more appellate experience than almost any attorney in New Hampshire. And still, in his limited free time, Mr. Aframe has made it a priority to give back to the next generation of legal minds. Outside of the courtroom, he is an adjunct professor at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law, where he teaches First Amendment law. He's also a frequent and popular volunteer at Civics 603, which is a nonprofit that provides civics education to New Hampshire students, ranging from elementary to high school. Beyond the classroom, Mr. Aframe has continued to take on numerous leadership positions, including as the U.S. Attorney's Office representative to New Hampshire's LASER program, which allows low and mid-level drug defendants to participate in a year-long recovery program that centers on rehabilitation and productive reintegration into society. Mr. Aframe's commitment to his community and to sharing the wealth of his legal experience to better the lives of others is truly commendable. I'm confident that Mr. Aframe will carry his sentiment with him to the First Circuit and will continue to make the Granite State proud. Now, before I close, though, I want to address some of the misinformation that has been circulated in an attempt to portray Mr. Aframe, a 17-year federal prosecutor, as soft on crime. There have been distortions of Mr. Aframe's record in 2 specific cases, and I want to talk about those now. Notably, in both of those cases, the court handed down a shorter sentence than what was requested by Mr. Aframe. In one of the cases, the government didn't seek a life sentence because doing so would have required the young victim to appear at a sentencing hearing. And after consulting with the victim's family, the government concluded that to call the victim would likely impose unwarranted additional trauma. As a result, Mr. Aframe requested a 405-month sentence. The court ultimately sentenced the defendant to 384 months. But to allege that Mr. Aframe is soft on crime because of his decision to abide by the wishes of a victim's family is not only deeply misguided, but it also sets a dangerous precedent. In the second case, as Mr. Aframe has noted, the government requested a sentence of 60 years, and the court, deciding the government's request was too harsh, issued a sentence of 50 years, 10 fewer than Mr. Aframe had requested. So, unfortunately, the allegations against Mr. Aframe are not only inaccurate and unfair, but they are based on partisan opposition to any judge that's nominated by this president. Those of us who know Mr. Aframe and his record know he has been a dedicated prosecutor and that he will be a fair jurist. So once again, let me emphasize that I am grateful that the state of New Hampshire has had a career prosecutor like Mr. Aframe, who has so diligently fought for justice on behalf of the victims of horrific crimes. And it's become abundantly clear that all who worked with him feel the same way. In a joint letter, all 4 former U.S. attorneys who Mr. Aframe has served under and who were appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents said, and I quote, "Each of us regards Mr. Aframe as a distinguished and persuasive appellate advocate who has successfully represented the government and earned a well-deserved reputation for excellence. His knowledge of the law is extensive. His writing is pristine and persuasive. We doubt there is any practicing attorney who has briefed and argued more cases before the First Circuit." And Mr. Aframe's praise doesn't come just from prosecutors. A group of defense attorneys who he litigated against many times have also lauded his nomination, stating, and I quote, "We believe Seth has a perfect judicial temperament. In what is often a difficult role as a prosecutor, he epitomizes open-mindedness, courtesy, patience, freedom from bias, and commitment to equal justice under the law." Now, to name a few others, Mr. Aframe has received letters of support from the former president of the New Hampshire Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers, from New Hampshire law enforcement officials, and from past presidents of the New Hampshire Bar. Madam President, I have some of these letters of support here, and I ask unanimous consent that they be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. So, Seth Aframe is uniquely positioned to serve on the federal bench, and I know that his unwavering integrity and deep appellate experience will make him an exceptional addition to the First Circuit. I was pleased with the cloture vote last Thursday, and I urge my colleagues to support his nomination. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President. And I rise today to add my voice to that of my colleague, Senator Shaheen, in supporting the confirmation of Seth Aframe of Hopkinton, New Hampshire, to serve as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. As you've heard from Senator Shaheen, Mr. Aframe would be a valuable addition to the First Circuit bench. Granite Staters know Mr. Aframe as someone who brings thoughtful judgment and a commitment to fairness to whatever work he is undertaking. He has demonstrated this unwavering commitment to fairness, to justice, time and again in his work at the U.S. Attorney's Office, including when he argued cases before the First Circuit. He exemplified those same values in his work on the Laser Docket, a drug court that helps people struggling with addiction to get the treatment that they need, an issue that is particularly important to the people of New Hampshire who have been hit hard by the fentanyl crisis. His excellence on the job goes hand in hand with a commitment to his community. Even in the midst of his demanding legal career, he continues to find time to give back to his community. He has served both as a member of his local school board and as president of his synagogue, Temple Beth Jacob. Mr. Aframe has also been dedicated to raising up our next generation of advocates and judges. He taught at the University of New Hampshire's Law School for 15 years, where he was regularly given his time to serve as a judge at student mock trials. Mr. Aframe's commitment to the law, as well as to his community, extends far beyond the confines of his office or work schedule and reflect the values of someone who understands that the commitment to equal justice, so essential to our democracy, must be highlighted and revered at every level and in every corner of our society. Throughout the nomination process, members of New Hampshire's legal community have also voiced their strong support for Mr. Aframe's confirmation. 4 previous United States attorneys for the District of New Hampshire, appointed by presidents from both parties, wrote a letter stating, quote, "Each of us regards Mr. Aframe as a distinguished and persuasive appellate advocate who has successfully represented the government and earned a well-deserved reputation for excellence," close quote. And it's not only Mr. Aframe's fellow prosecutors who have confidence in his abilities. New Hampshire defense attorneys, including public defenders, also trust and support Mr. Aframe. Charles J. Keefe, writing a letter on behalf of the New Hampshire defense attorneys, wrote that, quote, "In what is often a difficult role as prosecutor, he epitomizes open-mindedness, courtesy, patience, freedom from bias, and commitment to equal justice under the law." Mr. Aframe also has the backing of many New Hampshire law enforcement officers, including one letter that highlighted, quote, "We have observed firsthand Seth's professionalism and unmatched abilities as a federal prosecutor. His honesty, straightforward demeanor, and overall compassion for people have distinguished him in that role," close quote. And I will add that on Friday's New Hampshire Police Memorial Day ceremony, there was more than one member of law enforcement who approached me and said, "Seth Aframe is the right person for this job." It speaks to Mr. Aframe's capabilities and character that he has received such enthusiastic support from both sides of the courtroom, from the legal community and law enforcement alike. Mr. Aframe receives such widespread support because people from across our legal system see in him someone who is skilled and thoughtful in equal measure, who is always looking for more ways to serve his community and his country, who serves in every role without fear or favor, who needs to be confirmed so that he can continue his lifetime of service next on the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Thank you, Madam President. With that, I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the Aframe nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary, Seth Robert Aframe of New Hampshire to be United States Circuit Judge for the First Circuit.
The question occurs on the confirmation. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran.
Two votes, okay, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, as we all closure of Martinez.
Mr. Mullen.
On the large calendar.
Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Booker, Butler, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gillibrand, Hassan, King, Lujan, Merkley, Murkowski, Murray, Padilla, Peters, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Stabenow, Warner, Warren, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Grassley, Johnson, Kennedy, Romney, Thune, Tillis. Mrs. Brett, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Braun, Mr. Braun. No. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Fetterman, Mr. Fetterman. Aye. Mr. Mullen, Mr. Mullen. No. Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schmidt. No. Ms. Collins, Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Ms. Smith, Ms. Smith. Aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Budd. No. Mr. Vance, no. Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Markey, aye.
Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Ricketts, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Wicker, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 40. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
President.
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 571.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is approved. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Dina M. Coggins of California to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of California.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 571, Dina M. Coggins of California, to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of California, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is approved.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 552.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is approved. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Defense, Melissa Griffin Dalton of Virginia, to be Undersecretary of the Air Force.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 552, Melissa Griffin Dalton of Virginia, to be Undersecretary of the Air Force, signed by 18 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today, May 20th, be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I understand there's a bill at the desk that is due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S4361, a bill making emergency supplemental appropriations for border security and combating fentanyl for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2024, and for other purposes.
In order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, I understand there's a bill at the desk, and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.R. 8369, an act to provide for the expeditious delivery of defense articles and defense services for Israel and other matters.
I now ask for a second reading, and in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will receive its second reading on the next legislative day.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the appointment of the desk appears separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
And finally, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, May 21. That following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Lanham nomination. Further, that the cloture motions filed during Thursday's session ripen at 11:30 a.m., and that following the cloture vote on the Lanham amendment, the Senate recess until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly caucus meetings. Further, that if cloture has been invoked on the Lanham nomination, all time be considered expired at 2:15. Further, that if any nominations are confirmed during Tuesday's session, the motion to reconsider be considered made laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.